Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 50 Years Hands-on Agile meetup. Today we are hosting Petra Wille, a well-known product leader, trainer, coach, who will be talking about her experience with product community of practice for product people. She ran a survey last year and she spoke to many people in the industry how they were organizing their community of practices, why this is a good thing, and probably why you should think about doing this in your own organization if you haven't yet done so. Petra, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being.
Stefan. Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me, particularly on that super niche topic of communities of practice.
I totally love this. I've been dabbling with community of practices my whole professional life, and
Yeah.
why reinvent the wheel? If you can learn from other people, so much easier. I think Bismarck once said, "Just morons learn from their own mistakes." Other people learn from other people. Smart people learn from other people, or something along that line. And I think this is a very good example for doing so.
Exactly. That's what we're doing right now with your lovely community, right? It's a community of practice as well. So
Exactly. So, for the curious among us, what is a community of practice?
yeah, there are various definitions, but the one that I use is a community of practice ideally forms around a certain topic. And it could be something really specific, like a framework or tool or methodology. So story mapping or running retrospectives. Or it could be something a bit broader. So all the people at a company that share the same role, product owners / product management folks, could form a community of practice and share what they learn together. I think we will dive into more things of what is the purpose of communities of practice in a minute, I guess. So that's usually it. So you have a certain topic, several people are interested in, and they decide to share what they learned or learn together, share best practices, and get better at their craft when it comes to this particular topic they decided to pick. So that's basically my definition of a community of practice, which is rather broad. And the community of product practice is all things product. And I saw that from being communities focused on product leadership. So how do I run a product organization when I'm in charge of the product organization? So that's more for the people more senior in the roles, more later in their career. Or it can be all the junior product owner folks at the company that learn together and are maybe still even in an onboarding process or something like that. So there are various versions and maturity stages of product communities of practice as well.
How would you best describe the benefits of a community of practice? So where's the beef, so to speak? Why have one?
So let's look at that from 3 angles. So one is the actual participants. So let's think about the product people that are working at an organization. And I'm talking about internal communities of practice for a moment. There are other ones like this one here, which is an external community of practice. But let's focus on the internal ones that are happening inside a company and organization for a minute. So it's the people attending. That's the members of the community, so to say. Then it's the people line managing those folks. They have an interest, and I will talk about the advantages for them as well. And then it's the organization itself. So the company itself and what's their interest, right? So if we go look at the company's interest and leadership interest, so the line management folks, what's in for them? And if I have to explain to companies what's the advantage of vibrant community of practice, it is most and for all the employee retention tool. Because if you have a vital and well-running community of practice, people are able to experience their mastery to some extent. And shout out to Daniel Pink. And he was talking about autonomy and mastery and purpose. That's what everybody's striving for in their careers, right? And mastery is something that people can experience in moments when they share with others what they've learned. And that is what community often is all about, or that they can share together and then have these aha, heureka moments of, oh, now finally we understood how to solve this particular problem or how to use this particular framework. So it is a really strong employee retention tool. Then something else that it actually delivers from the company leadership perspective is people evolve over time. And a lot of other things that help doing this are rather expensive. So people get better in what they do when they consume content, when they go to trainings, when they attend conferences, when they maybe have a coach for some things that they do. But some of that is really price intense, where community work is usually not that costly for an organization. We could talk about, okay, is there a budget that needs to be granted to community of practice to make it really work in a nice and interesting way? Definitely, yes, but still, it's usually not as expensive as trainings or sending people to conference. And I'm still saying that companies should do that. But on the side, it really helps if people can learn from each other. And for example, if one person went to the conference and is bringing their learning back and is doing a bit of curation for their peers and saying like, hey, these 3 talks have really resonated with me, and I think they're really highly applicable to our situation. So let's watch it together, for example. So these are things that could happen. So people get better over time when they're in a community of practice. You save some money on the personal development of all your folks. That's another thing. Then last but not least, it usually saves a lot of time on the onboarding and maybe even sometimes hiring bits that leadership folks usually have to do. In some of my clients' community of practice, the community is strongly involved in the hiring process sometimes, and more likely, for example, in the onboarding of new colleagues, which otherwise would end up in the calendar of the direct line management folks, right? So it's a bit of a time management trick for people in leadership positions. So that's the advantages from the companies and management side. And for the actual participants, it's the same along these lines of, hey, I get better at what I do. I really form bonds that are mine to keep. So even if I'm leaving this company, leaving this job, moving onward in my career, the community of practice connections are usually there to keep and to stay, and I can leverage that even later in my career. So it's the networking idea around it, it's the learning idea around it, and then it's this experience mastery idea around it, because it's another way of how humans learn is by reflecting what has worked for them in their particular context and then sharing it with others, or even explaining it to new colleagues in the onboarding process, or new colleagues that just are not familiar with the jobs to be done framework or story mapping, or you name it. But it's just a nice experience to contribute to a community. And that's, I'd say, the benefits for the actual active participants.
That sounds like a Swiss Army knife to it serves a lot of different purposes. It's not just merely knowledge management with a human touch.
It can be so many things. I work with some clients where they focus on one particular thing. So for example, content curation across the company. So what are the contents everybody is consuming, reading, turning towards if they have a question, stuff like that. So some communities have really focused on things like that, and it's maybe not the Swiss Army knife. There's really like just one of these tools on the Swiss Army knife. But for others, it's really more a super diverse set of things. Oftentimes, members of the community cannot precisely explain what they think the purpose of their community is, because some are here for the networking, others are here for the learning, and then they just join the rituals that they like and that they think they benefit them the most. So some join the networking on-site events, others are happy doing a curation mural board for the onboarding purpose. So it's really a broad variety of things that a community of practice could do.
What are most popular forms of usage regarding community of practices? You mentioned content curation in a sense to spread knowledge across the organization. Are there other particular forms that come to your mind?
Yes, so rituals and rhythm is actually the headline of your question. So to say, so what are rituals that are actually working for all the people out there? And you were already saying, like, I surveyed more than 100 people, and I took interviews, long, extensive interviews with people running communities of practice. So for example, somebody at Google who is responsible, part of the team that runs the European community of product practice for Google. Or I interviewed Teresa Torres, who is running the continuous discovery habits community and company external community, so to say. And from all of that, I published that in a blog post, learned a lot about the rituals that work in various settings and for various companies. And so that's a stretch. I think it's 40, 50 things that are in this blog post, but it's things like watching talks together or running corporate book clubs. So where 5 or 6 people that are interested in a certain topic decide to read a book together. And while they do so, share what they learn and what their takes are, and if they think it could be helpful in their company's context. So that's the learning together is definitely one of the themes. Then learning from each other. That's showcasing the work that you did. It's maybe showing, hey, that's the product strategy that we created, and that's the product strategy that we created. Are there any learnings? What are the similarities? Do we see pattern in the process, how we actually created those, where we could actually learn from the best, or just like take the pieces out that we like a lot and incorporate in our own behavior. So these, for example, are rituals that work well. So sharing and showcasing your work. That's a bit like what we do with review meetings to some extent in the whole Agile Scrum world, right? So that's on a meta level, definitely. It's not the daily work. That's, by the way, an anti-pattern. Rituals that focus on status updates. Some companies flagging those ones as community events, but that's a bit of an anti-pattern. So usually community events look at building the shipyard and not so much building the ships. So it's not about the products themselves. It's not about the daily work. It's not a status update. It's not a stand up in front of a task board. It usually is more like, okay, how can we make sure that we're doing things in a consistent way, or do we need to do it in a consistent way, or where do we want to do things differently but still know what the others are doing? So that definitely are other rituals that work. Some just do themed brown bagging sessions. That's what a lot of companies do as well. So they say like, hey, let's have a data crunching breakfast every once in a while where we dive into other people's dashboards and just like poke holes in it and play devil's advocate and ask certain questions. So it's a bit of a peer consulting setup that they're using for their community of practice. And the list goes on and on and on. Bring learnings back from conferences, bringing learnings back from trainings. In some companies, it's even, I call it defining your good. So the question is always who holds what makes a great product person in our company. So the competency profile, the role description, the what are people responsible for. And with some of my clients, that is something that the company delegated to the community of practice. So the community creates the role descriptions and agrees on, product management assessments, for example, and all these kind of things. So it really varies from company to company, but it's always this meta level and not focusing on your daily work, so to say.
Is there a certain level of formality required to successfully operate a community of practice? So, but you already mentioned the classic question: do we need to have a cost center and a budget?
Yeah, exactly.
Be taken seriously, you know.
Yeah, that is another. So, how do you start a product community of practice? That's another thing that I try to wrap my head around. Usually, it starts super informal, and you should focus on the interpersonal connection first, and not so much on the formality. And then just sees what naturally the people are gravitating towards. Because maybe it's the sharing bit, maybe it's the content curation bit, maybe it's the learning from each other bit, maybe it's the learning with each other bit. So you don't know. And I think it is super hard to start a community of practice by mandate, so to say. So it's easier to connect people first, to make some room so that they can mingle and talk about things that are currently challenges and that might benefit from sharing across the board with other product peers and product colleagues, right? So usually it's focus on the personal connections first, and then find small groups. So maybe there's one group that wants to learn more about product discovery, and then there is another group that says like, yeah, we're quite good at the discovery bit, but strategy is something that we struggle with, and you form the small communities of practice and see how that is going. But at some point, and you're right, Stefan, you need a bit of maturing the community work, right? And it definitely makes sense to talk about things like, okay, who are members of this community? Are leadership folks invited, or are they deliberately excluded because we want to keep it on the individual contributor level? Do we want our engineering and design folks to join? Are they friends and actively listening in to the things that we're actually doing here? Or are they active members driving the conversations with us? Are we inviting them every once in a while when we think we have interesting topics to discuss? Or are they real members? So that's really who is the member, who decides who is allowed to join the community of practice. That's definitely conversations that you need to have at some point in time. And it makes sense to talk about the purpose of the community of practice, at least that it's written somewhere. And it can be refined. It has to be refined because as the members, change over time, you might need to bring this up every once in a while. Then are there shared values or community guidelines? So how do we make sure that even the most introvert, most junior person in the room has a seat at the table and would be, willing to share some of their struggles or learning? How can we create this certain level of psychological safety that is required for actually doing this? So all of these might be questions that you want to ask yourself or the community later in the process. So that's definitely the values, the purpose, maybe even what's the success definition. So what is everybody hoping to get out of this community work? And how do we measure? So is it return on time invested? Or is it for a lot of companies to say, like, if it's self-sustainable, we don't want to invest 2 people that are constantly nourishing the community of practice. If it's an active community, it's self-sustainable, then there are a few people that are active stewards of this community of practice. They make sure the rituals are happening. They suggest maybe new rituals. They might facilitate some of the sessions. And then there is this other active members. But usually there are a ton of people that are just listening in, reading some of the things, maybe posting a link on Slack every once in a while in the Worthy Reads channel or something like that. And I think all of this contribution is beautiful. But the success definition question is another one that you want to touch upon at some point in time. Not at the beginning. That's people. Focus on the people in the beginning.
Do you observe certain formalities evolving with company or organizational size? So does Google have dedicated community members that do nothing else but running the community?
Not at Google. I don't know globally, but the ones that I talked to about the European community, they're doing that on top of what they actually do as a product person. That's another thing. Incentives and rewards and actually sponsoring of the community of practice, something that you want to discuss. In some companies, it's more hey, we expect you to contribute to your product management tribe to some extent. So it's not optional. It's something that we just expect as a company that's baked in our culture. That's what you do. In some companies, you get kudos for investing a lot of your time into the community of practice. And in the most companies that I saw allow people to invest some of their working hours into the community work. So then it's more like, okay, everybody has this 5% of their working hours as personal learning time, and you either can go to a conference or the hack week, or you invest it in the community of practice work. So that is pretty common. For example, book clubs, the question is, okay, but do we need to do this in our evening hours and in our private time, or is it something that we can do on a Wednesday morning? So that's definitely a conversation that you need to have someone with your sponsors, usually leadership. And it oftentimes is that there is a rule somewhere. It's just not clear to the employees. So that's something that I would encourage you to do. Figure out what's the take of your company on that particular thing: personal learning, personal education, personal progression. And are people allowed to read a book in their working hours? Are they allowed to share with the colleagues the best practices and what they learned? And then in bigger organizations that I'm working with, they often have product operations teams that at some point in time invest some of their time into upskilling of the product organization. And then they often are the ones facilitating sessions. I always advise them to not become the executive assistant of the head of product, just that they run the community of practice for the rest of the people within the organization. I think that's a bit of a weird setup for a community. But still, they help with facilitation. They sometimes help with, hey, the community wants to do an offsite, for example, then they take care of bookings or something like that. But only if the major push comes from and out of the community. So yeah, or transformation offices oftentimes do these kind of things. And I saw a lot of agile coaches, for example, pushing the product organizations towards, hey, you're so siloed, you product people. Could you please start sharing across the board and talking to each other, not only regards the products you're creating, but as well as how you're doing these things and how you're approaching stuff, how you're making decisions, which processes you are actually going to use and these kind of things. So, yeah.
Have you noticed that some organizations are allocating budget to community of practices that they can spend at their own discretion?
Yeah, some allocate massive budgets to the community of practice because they strongly believe in, and that's a bit of a funny belief I always find, we're so special. It doesn't help if we send our people to the trainings that exist out there. So maybe we get the trainer in here and then they customize an in-house training. And often the community of practice is doing the curation. So whom to invite for the training, who to invite for, a lot of communities do, I call it external stimulus talks. So they bring somebody in to talk about a specific topic. And they decide if all of the companies should hear it. The product development organization, including engineering and design, should be hearing it. So they often have this kind of training or speaker budget at the larger corporates. And mostly all of the companies that I saw running a community of practice for a longer period of time have smaller budgets allocated to it, which allows people to buy books or do self-paced trainings and then share back to the organization what they actually learned in the self-paced trainings. And some have no budget at all and have a time budget so that they can invest time in the community work. Or, for example, if one decides to share their experience about story mapping, that's easily 8 hours investment to be ready to share it with your colleagues, because first of all, you have to reflect on what actually were our learnings. Then you have to dig out a bit of material and examples and put it on slides and all these kind of things. And in these cases, it's more a time budget that people get granted when they want to do this kind of things.
So, dear listeners, just in case if you plan to create a community of practice because you want to avoid Marty Kagan, this is a long way,
Yeah. Especially outside of the company, it's even a long way, as you know, Stefan. And inside of the company, it's still work, right?
Yeah. Totally. How do you start a community of practice? I mean, besides that, you now think of a startup or a fast-growing organization that now thinks, okay, we go full in product and we need a practice. How do you go about it?
Yeah, that is so different. So oftentimes it doesn't need an external push because, imagine you are a small startup and there may be 3 product owners / product management folks. At some point in time, they realize, okay, it might make sense if every once in a while we take some time off and reflect on how we're doing things and why we're doing things. And in the beginning, there's always this mix of the actual real current challenges that they have with the products and the things that are a bit more meta. And most likely they're discussing all of that on the same day or at the same offsite, the 3 people. But as the team grows and as more process is applied and maybe a bit more formalities to how a product actually operates, it's easier to split those 2 and say like, hey, here we're talking about our portfolio and the products and the people that we want to serve and the strategic things. And on the other hand, we want to talk about what we learned the last 6 months while doing so and what worked well and what didn't. And that's usually, so it usually starts really naturally. Usually the only thing that leadership or the company has to take care of is that you make room for them and are not stopping them from talking about these more meta things. And if you do so, usually it evolves over the course of 12 months, 24 months, And then at some point in time, you need to have this conversation. Okay, now it's a bigger group, it's 20 people. Now we need to decide who are members, how can members join, what's the purpose of this, what are values, what are communication guidelines, what's our success definition. But that is when you hit a certain number. I think it's 20, 25 people when you first need to have this conversation. And then you need to decide about, okay, what are the rituals? Maybe one bi-weekly meeting is not enough. Maybe we want to have a product academy once a year where we really do deep dives on things that we learned and share tools that worked for us as well. And then we still could have a mini stand-up, blog posts that we wrote or helpful talks that we watched or the book clubs or all these kind of things, right? So then it's rituals and rhythm and all these things that you need to talk about. But first, usually just make sure that you do not stop the people that naturally gravitate towards talking to others and sharing what they learned with others.
That is certainly helpful. What I always enjoyed was running bar camps or open spaces, so just invite people and see what's going to happen.
Yeah, and when you have like 12 to 20 people, that already makes sense, right? A lot of sense that people say like, hey, I would like to take the stage and just share what we learned about this particular thing last month or something like that. Yeah, but you need a bit of a culture of sharing. Definitely helps. And I said the question is always, how do we make sure the most introvert, most junior person would be comfortable sharing as well? So that is, if you're running the community, that might be one of the things you really think about. And maybe you decide, okay, it's cool if you do it. Maybe you do a talk in front of all the product management folks. Maybe it's a blog post that you write, an internal blog post that not even the world out there sees, but maybe that's easier format for the people that are not so willing to enter a stage and share what they learned. Because I think diversity in community of practice really matters, and we want to leverage all the voices that we have in our product organization. So that's maybe one thing that you might think about.
I have one question left before we can move on to the Q&A section, and it's one of my favorite topics, anti-patterns. I totally believe in this Charlie Munger approach, just flip the perspective and try to figure out what is going on and maybe get a better understanding what is happening. So if you look back at your own experience and all the talks that you had over the years, so what are surefire ways of killing a nascent community of practice? What works best?
What works best in killing communities so definitely what works best is don't allow any room for community of practice work. So if people start sharing, you say like, no, actually we have OKRs, you focus on your key results, don't share, don't talk to the other people, heads down, work on what we actually want to achieve. I think we always need to plan for a bit of learning and reflection, because it helps everybody to get better over time, and then you will more quickly hopefully achieve your key Rs in the next quarter. So it makes sense to invest a bit of your time in improving the way how things are actually going. And really not allowing this room for reflection, not allowing room for thinking things through, and not allowing room for sharing is definitely one of the anti-pattern. And then another thing that I saw, I was helping a client last year. They wanted to start a community of practice in a pretty big product organization, which was like 250 product people in total. And they decided to really start it from scratch and from their transformation office centrally with this mandate-led approach. And the product people were just not ready for it. So they were super siloed. They were not talking that much to each other as well already. So there were no personal connections. And all these meetings and rituals felt so artificial to them. And they were not yet ready to share some of the struggles and learnings because, again, personal connection, trust not yet formed. That basically didn't work. So I think they tried it for 4 to 5 months to make it working and invested a lot of money and get it going. And still people didn't make room in their calendars for it because they didn't know why they should. And as said, there was no trust level amongst the participants. I think that is another anti-pattern. So you need to find the small nucleus of people that are then, this active stewards of the community of practice and that start sharing and that form these trusty bonds before you actually look into the topics and all these kind of things. Just to name 2 anti-patterns, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a classic anti-pattern, I believe. Agile can't be pushed; it needs to be pulled. You can't force people to be agile or something like that. It's the same with being a member or an active member of a community of practice. You can't draft people. So it doesn't work via conscription. So
you can definitely add more fun to it with a bit of budget and a bit more time for everybody. But you cannot just start by telling everybody, now we start the community of practice. Participate. Yeah.
I need 3 volunteers: Michael, Thomas, and Catherine.
Yeah, you are the first community of practice at this company.
Okay. Totally. So we have a few questions. Are you ready for those? So the first one: what communities of practice are open for people who want to transition to become a product managers?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would suggest in one of my blog posts, go dig it out. I have a list of external communities of practice that people have been mentioning in the survey. So in one of the survey blog posts, there is a list of these communities. And what I usually suggest is not only join the communities, let's use Mind the Product as one example, right? That's a massive movement. It's so many people that are going to ProductTanks and are in their Slack channel. I think it's 42,000 people in their Slack channel alone. So that doesn't make sense and it's not helpful to you. But maybe you can find 4 people or 3 people inside of this huge community of practice that currently facing the same challenge or similar challenge than you. And then you create your small learning group. And that applies for whatever community you're joining. So Lenny's newsletter, Lenny's podcast community is massive as well. More than 300,000 product people joined that one to some extent. And you only have to find 3 or 4 that are having similar challenges, right? So that would be my tip. And you can find those next door. So you can even find them here, maybe if you ask. So the only thing is first, hey, that's where I'm currently at. That's my current challenges. Is there anybody else looking into these kind of similar challenges right now? And would you be up for, I don't know, suggest something, a weekly check-in, a monthly call? Maybe it's just something specific like a book club, because that is usually easy. If you find somebody else who says yeah, I'm interested in reading this particular book, let's do it together and share what we see and discuss our perspectives on it. I think that is super helpful. Go look at what community of practices are out there for product people, and then find your folks within this bigger group of community folks.
I agree. There's no shortage of communities around. I mean, and many of those are basically available for free.
Yeah. Most of them are free to join.
So
or example, you pay with your email address, maybe.
Yeah. So for example, I set up a Slack group 7 years ago. So hands-on Agile Slack. So the sibling to the meetup, and we're 13,000 people or so. And it's really amazing because 300-400 people, well, so the usual suspects, so to speak, are active, and you can ask very stupid questions till 3 o'clock in the morning, and the Australians will answer them with endless patience.
Work as the sun goes. I love that. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, and that, by the way, that applies to all communities of practice. You have, for every one active participant, you have another 10 that are inactive, but still active in terms of actively reading things and digesting stuff. Maybe not so good in contributing content-wise, but don't underestimate that big layer of people that are just active observers, because they get a lot of input from the communities of practice conversations as well still.
Simple tip from my side: if you like to know more about these patterns and numbers and statistics, create a good post on LinkedIn and watch how many impressions the post gets and how many people are actively contributing, how many people are liking, how many people are commenting, and you see there's amazing correlation.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's the usual also. So of 100 people, 90 just consume it. Maybe 9 are from time to time contributing, and 1% is the hardcore.
Exactly, the hardcore folks that create content themselves. I digged out the blog post, so there's a list in there. If you want to, I put it in the chat.
Okay, so we have another interesting question. What product skills can be trained with katas at community of practices?
Can the person asking the question talk a bit what they mean with katas?
That would be a good idea.
Yes, hello.
Hi, Ivan!
The question is about katas that usually a software craftsmanship community has as a practice. So, for example, they practice in test-driven development together. And I'm curious about the same approach. Is it applicable in products, skills training, or what you observed about that?
Ooh, that's a great question. So not that product management is that formalized in some areas. I think it's oftentimes easier for the developers to create these things as there are more of them in an organization. And in a team, to some extent, there is always the engineering community of practice, which consists of the 4 to 6 developers on the team anyways already, right? And product people always have to reach out to other product teams and other product managers to do so and to discuss these things. So I saw this less to be a thing that they're really formalizing working practices in charter-like structures, I'd say. But what I often see is that they have a certain challenge, and then they exchange ways how everybody's tackling that. And some teams may say like, yeah, we're solving this by using opportunity solution trees because that really helps us to see what opportunities we get in front of us. And it helps us ideate on what solutions might solve these problems / opportunity. And then we think about, okay, what experiments could help us to get closer to know which of these solutions is a good solution. And then another team might say like, yeah, all nice, but we're solving the exact same things with a slightly different set of methodologies and tools. So what I often see is that they align on their ways of working, but they not necessarily use the exact same methodologies and frameworks in product organizations, which I think is a good thing. But the conversation alone about how actually do you work in your product team versus how we work in our product team helps them to understand this. Okay, we just use different things for actually the same steps of a process. So that is something that I see happening a lot. And then sometimes they have more this meta sessions where they talk about, okay, discovery and figuring out if the problem is big enough and how actually are we doing this, or if the solution is good enough and how we run these experiments. And sometimes they're talking about really specific things of, hey, these 3 teams are using jobs to be done. Can we just share how we do it and what the differences are and how we believe that helps us?
Yeah.
These kind of things is what I see a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this deliberate practice, like with jobs to be done framework, can be packed into this small kata exercise. Like if somebody doesn't know how to do this, we can simulate some very simple job discovery just in 15 minutes to show how it's going.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, this more practical approach, but I believe this is quite rare thing. So I just an idea. Yeah.
So some do this show and tell. So you show, I show me, I show you, you show me mine, and this kind of circle. So that often happens, and especially for junior folks, I see that happening a lot with backlog item writing, despite the fact that everybody is putting it in ChatGPT these days. But before ChatGPT, I saw a lot of product people doing, especially junior product people doing reviews with peers. So, hey, these are my backlog items, show me your backlog items, and then let's see what we can learn from each other and how both backlog item writing processes can improve. So that's something that I have been, seeing a lot.
Cool, thank you.
Welcome.
And we have roughly 10 minutes left. What about the following? Would you recommend using CLPs to introduce new ways of thinking into the company?
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. It's exactly what I was referring to when I said like that some companies really deliberately curate a list of things, and companies in terms of some people from the community of practice, and they really try to identify white spots in the whole product management knowledge ecosystem. So maybe they figure out, okay, we could get better in setting goals. We're doing it really quite differently in the several teams, and still it feels not as we would be mastering that skill. Then they really deliberately think about, okay, how could we start bringing this knowledge in? And usually they do it by what great content is out there that everyone could consume. That's the curational aspect I was already talking about. And what are the things that we as the company want to focus on? Because you know the drill. They read a book, and then that's the Bible to some extent. So you always want to make sure that at least there is another book that everybody is reading, and then you can actually think about, okay, what are the takes from these two books, and what is our way of approaching things and doing things in this organization? Same applies to, if don't watch one talk on OKRs, maybe watch 3 from different people, and then you might get an idea of what might work for you, and you still have to try it, and you still have to see how it actually went. But that is something that community of practice often do, try to identify white spots, white spaces in the knowledge landscape map of the company, and then thinking about how could we actually, close this gap or make it smaller by inviting external speakers, by watching content or bringing content in that nobody is yet aware of existing. It oftentimes, for example, that's one of my big findings in the survey. A lot of people have never heard of the fact that there are external communities of practice. It really so often is the case in all of my coachings, and from what I hear from other coaches, that people have never heard of external product communities of practice. So that is another thing. So make sure that everybody knows about certain content and knows about certain offerings and possibilities and communities to join. And that's definitely something that I see communities to be responsible for and actively doing.
The next one, you already mentioned OKRs. What if the company follows OKRs? How do we ensure that the groups engage with relevant OKRs in mind? Perhaps even how the OKRs can be better implemented.
That question could be interpreted in 2 ways. Maybe if I'm going down the wrong route, please get me back, whoever asked the question. Then just jump on camera and reframe the question, please. So what I often see happening in companies that understood that getting better in what they do, product management-wise, is something that is vital for the company right now, it ends up in either the one objective or a smaller key result, right? So they build in learning into their key results, and not only the learning about the product, how people are using it, and the user groups out there and their customers. It equally can touch upon things like personal development of the people that you have. There could be employee happiness that sometimes is something companies put on their OKR sheets. Not always, because you don't want, if you only focus on employee happiness all the time, then nobody makes some money. So definitely, but maybe something that you want to accompany in some of your OKR sets every once in a while, right? So that is one thing. And then the other route that we could go down with this question is, how do you make sure, for example, Karen, I was asking the question and wants to add to it?
Yeah, hi. I think 2 is probably going to be where I was thinking. How do you make sure that they're not going off the rails? That they're aligned with the OKRs.
The stuff that the community of practice does.
Right.
Yeah. So it really depends. I saw so many shitty OKR sets. So assuming that is a good OKR set that the company is working with, I think it makes total sense. And company of practice usually do this if they're familiar with the OKR set that the company is using, and hopefully they are. Otherwise, red flag. They use it to frame some of the things that they do, because if they know, okay, that's the thing that we tackle for the next 3 months. But maybe to do this in a good way, we either have to share the results in the end, or we have to learn something new, and maybe we do it in the first months of the quarter, not in the latter. Can the community of practice help to upskill everybody pretty quickly or something like that? So that is something how they use it. It's a bit more used as a filter mechanism for the topics that they pick for the next rituals that are coming up in an ideal scenario, right? But oftentimes the OKR set has nothing to do with what the community of practice actually does, and with the personal learning and with the improvement of every person on the team. And that's basically good as well, because what OKR should do, they should give you radical focus, and there should be this direction, the thing providing directional clarity for everybody. And if all the things that the company does is included in your OKR set, then it's not helpful anyways. So hopefully there are no too detailed OKR sets that even touch on the work of the community of practice. That's more a behind the scenes thing that has to happen to keep the engine running in the future and in the longer term. But using it as a filter for some of the topics everybody is discussing, that is the most common thing that I see, I guess.
Thank you. And perhaps even they could work if they see the OKRs are off the rails, right? That they could give some input to that.
That is another thing. So, and that's a super hard thing, by the way, to create, Karen. So if people see things not going well within the companies, if you have a vital community of practice, then employees don't go into complaint mode, because it's easy that everybody's using OKRs. Everybody thinks the OKRs suck. Nobody's actually talking about it. Maybe everybody's complaining to each other about that the OKR sets suck. But if you have a good and vital community of practice, they reach out to their peers and say, like, is it just me? Or do our OKR sets suck? And should we maybe invest the next 3 months in learning more about it, suggest really proactively what could be improved, maybe create an example of how we could have used OKRs better the last quarter so that everybody understands how we could change in the future. So that is another thing, that communities of practice could actually be a place where you first complain, raise a concern, but then really proactively and in a positive way project it further and think about what a solution could be for the rest of the organization. Yeah. And sometimes it's only managing up. And sometimes it's really get active and improve the things sidewards with your peers. That's usually the two solutions that people have at hand.
Thank you, Petra.
Thank you.
Our final question. It's a more tactical one.
Throw it at me.
How appropriate is feedback on talks within the community of practice, and how to do it well? How much radical candor is appropriate?
Feedback on talks members of the community are giving, or feedback on talks external speakers are giving?
My interpretation is that it's about the internal talks.
Yeah, that really depends on the feedback culture of the company that runs the community of practice, right? Because in some companies, people have never actually been exposed to any formal training on how to give and provide feedback in a positive, constructive, proactive way. Then often feedback is more harmful and not really helpful. So the question is always, are the people able to give feedback in a way that actually it helps the speaker? And that's another thing a community of practice could tackle, right? If they find, okay, giving feedback is something everybody struggles with, then hey, that's a session that someone could prepare, because maybe one person has already dived into the art of giving feedback and knows about situation, behavior, and intent. So that's the situation that we have. That's the behavior of you that I see. And I think that's the negative impact that it might have. So therefore, I provide you with this piece of feedback. So for example, structures like that could be shared across the members of the community of practice. And that's how a community of practice, for example, could even uplift such a meta topic, some people call it soft skill, I rather call it human skill topic, like giving feedback. Definitely something a community of practice could tackle. And then once that is done, super easy to give feedback to somebody else's talk, because then everybody knows how to do it in a helpful way. And I think that would, for example, be an idea how a community of practice could deal with things like that. And hopefully there's always a feedback mechanism, right? It's like return on time invested is a great quick one. So was this meeting, this session, this workshop, this talk worth your time? And if the rating is low, then you can go back as a facilitator and go deeper into the why actually wasn't it worth your time. And sometimes the reasons are more personal and don't have something to do with the actual content. Sometimes it's about the actual content. So yeah, definitely you need some mechanisms to measure, and you need to think about if everybody's already in a position to be good in giving feedback. And if not, that's your upskilling topic for the community of practice.
Petra, thank you so much for being here today, particularly
Loved it.
given that you are so busy, mainly end of June. What is happening?
Ooh, end of June. Yeah, glad you're asking. We're putting together a conference for, as we call it, curious product people. So it's more a product practitioner conference. It will be happening in Hamburg end of June. We hope to welcome 650 product people for one day of a lot of talks, but hopefully even networking and sharing. And it's a bit of a festival-like vibe, hopefully, because we rented a contemporary dance arts venue, which was a crane factory. So it's a pretty interesting setup and venue where we're taking it. And that's a one-day conference happening end of June in Hamburg.
Excellent. Who will be there?
I will be there on stage.
Of course.
And we're bringing Teresa Torres in. We'll
Cool.
be talking about user interviewing most likely. And Jeff Gotthelf is coming. John
Awesome.
Cutler is coming. And tons of other really interesting speakers. The themes that we group most of the stuff around is finding clarity of thought for yourself as a product person. So how do you think things through, and how do you make sure you can find this clarity of thought? Then it's giving directional clarity to your teams. So that might touch upon topics like strategy and road mapping and all these kind of things, setting goals. And then it's the topic of product operations. What is that all about? Is it a thing? Do we need this? Is it here to stay? And last but not least, it's learning from each other. Surprised that I picked this as a curational theme. And 3 speakers will be talking on that topic. For example, Nesrin from Google is joining us to share how Google is running their community of practice, but other people are talking about community work as well. So that's the curational themes.
So awesome. Dear listeners, if you do not know how to spend the end of June, Hamburg is lovely around that time.
The event is called Product at Heart, by the way.
Yes, please. It's also mentioned in the description of this event. So you find a link in there totally. And I think it's an amazing lineup of speakers. It's a perfect venue. It's a great topic. So why not think about
it?
Yeah.
And Hamburg in June.
Come on.
As good as
Yeah.
it gets.
Yes. Can't be better, you know.
Exactly.
Hopping on a Hardag ferry and going through the harbor, you know.
Yeah, that's
always
another
fun.
good thing that you could actually do.
Yeah, so I still like my birthplace, you know. Okay.
Still a fan. Cool. Thanks,
thank you so
Stefan.
much.
Great questions.
That
Thanks,
was awesome.
audience. I loved all the questions. So interesting. Cool.
Likewise, that was a good one.